Hello and welcome to another water cooler conversation from the Menzies Research Centre. I'm Nick Cater, Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, and I'm delighted today to be joined by my former colleague, Fred Pawle, our former Communications Director, but this time in his capacity as an esteemed biographer, the biographer of the cartoonist and artist Bill Leak. Fred, welcome back to Water Cooler.
G'day, Nick. Good to be back, mate. Great to be back.
Fred, the main business today, of course, is to draw upon the insights of your biography of Bill Leak. Die laughing. First, however, though, I want to take you back, if I may, to July 2018, when you and I sat in front of a couple of microphones to pioneer the Water Cooler podcast. Just have a listen to this. Welcome to the Water Cooler podcast, where we talk about some of the topics and issues that have been exercising our minds this week at the Menzies Research Centre. I'm Nick Cater, Executive Director, and with me is Fred Pawle. Welcome, Fred.
G'day, mate.
Plastic seemed to cause a bit of a fuss this week when I wrote a column about it in the Australian.
It's a never-ending topic, is it? I think this goes back to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch from a few years ago. Back in 2015, The Guardian reported that there was this massive patch of floating plastic in the North Pacific, and it was so dense and so big that it could be seen from outer space. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. The garbage patch you can see from space. Yeah.
That's it. Podcast number one, Fred, was all about the encroachment of the nanny state, specifically the proposal for a sugar tax, if you recall, which you defeated. It was great. We saw that one off. But fast forward to podcast 69, as this one is, and I have to wonder what's going on around us right now, whether we might have won the battle but lost the war against the nanny state. What do you think?
Mate, the nanny state is on every street corner of Australia right now. It's actually in our houses and in our workplaces. Yeah, I think we are definitely winning, not winning this war by a long shot. And it's interesting that we are talking about Bill tonight because, hardly a day goes by when I don't think how Bill would respond to what Australia has become. Of all the people I've ever met, of all the Australians I've ever known, nobody loved Australia more than Bill did. And his faith in Australia's potential to become a beacon of, without sounding too serious, of liberty and happiness and prosperity. He thought Australia was the best country in the world, and the way it is right now, he would despair to see how it's become.
Fred, I seem to recall that, even as we're recording that podcast more than 3 years ago, you'd already started to think and work on the book, the biography of Bill's life. I remember I was very encouraging you to do it. Somebody had to do it, and I could think of no better person to do it. But it's an astonishing book, I think. Bill's first of all, naturally the most naturally talented person I think I've ever had the pleasure to be acquainted with, and I guess you too. He had a larger-than-life story, so that immediately lends itself to a great biography. It's expertly told, of course, through the eyes of a journalist who not only understands the imperative to get the truth right, but also can write well, which doesn't always go with the patch, as you know. And most of all, I think, just to round it off, it's an important book because it's a parable for our censorious times. I remember when we discussed this book, and I was saying you should write it, I felt that it was a big burden on you, Fred, because, number one, you had a big life to pack into one volume, and you had a lot of work ahead to try and unravel the complications, what was true and what was not true. But more than that, I think you, like I, felt a tremendous sense of loss and pain. And I think it must have been very hard for you over that period to be immersed in Bill's life and thinking about that tragic end daily. How was that? How was it personally for you working through this book?
Oh, mate, that's a very good question and a good place to start. At first, it was actually very difficult. I mean, I still miss him. At first, being forced to think about Bill every day was not easy because, I missed him a lot. And then I kind of got into this habit of actually just having imaginary conversations with him. And so when I was, considering parts of the book to write, or even formulating sentences, or, wondering who to interview, all sorts of stuff, I just think, well, what would Bill say about this? What would Bill think about this? And actually, early on, I actually wrote a couple of passages, and I thought, oh, that's a pretty good passage. I've got that right. All the facts are straight, and it's in all in order. And then I'd read it back and go, actually, Bill would say that sucked. So out it went. And so I kind of got over that. I don't want to sound too nostalgic or maudlin about it, because Bill would not approve of that either. Eventually, it didn't take me too long. It actually became I became quite objective about it, and pursuing his story became just this mission that I was on. And another thing that I discovered early on, Nick, and you probably think about this yourself these days, is when I was discovering things about Bill that I didn't know, I would think, oh, geez, I wish Bill was still here because we could talk about this, Bill's company was so amazing and so energetic and so sort of larrikin that, you'd always get caught up in just drinking together and cracking jokes.
So, Fred, let's get down to the dichotomy, the great central dichotomy of Bill Leak. He was an accomplished painter. He could have been a great artist. He was a great artist, but he was a newspaper cartoonist as well. He was a knockabout guy, a larrikin, but he was a true intellectual. An intellectual, the best kind of an intellectual in Australia, those who try and keep their intellectualism from showing too much. Let me quote a few lines from your book to set this up. You write, Bill discovered that it was possible to be both a tough rat bag and sensitive enough to play Chopin and love great art. But he also discovered the prudence of only revealing one side of himself at a time. Earnest and charming with adults, a rebel in the schoolyard. The former earned him praise, the latter avoided getting into scraps. But as you go on to show, by the time he was in his late 40s, he became tired of pretending to be one Bill or the other. He became Bill Leak, a man who, as you write, quote, was willfully, even profoundly egalitarian. The only thing he couldn't stand were fools. That is... Tell me more about that, this central
Bill,
paradox, if you like.
One of the curious things about Bill was how the working class persona that he exuded. But Nick, he wasn't actually all that working class. He came from a very solid middle class family. His dad wasn't a working class person. I mean, they had working class characteristics. They loved to drink, they were larrikins, they loved to laugh, and they were very egalitarian people. But, they weren't ditch diggers. They were well off. And Bill was brought up in a family that revered music and revered intellectual pursuits. Literature was prominent in the family, and Bill read a lot as a young man. So it's fair to say that Bill's sort of working class persona was actually put on a little bit. And you can trace that to Bill's love of Australia, because Australia reveres the working class knockabout sort of bloke. And so Bill became one, essentially, while, as you say, retaining this love for beauty and for art and great literature. The thing about Bill is that he could talk about great art in any company and make it quite accessible. People have approached me and said, I learnt more about art in half an hour with Bill than I did in some of the great museums of Europe. So, Bill had this ability to cross from one demographic to another. The more amusing side of that is that he could crack incredibly lewd jokes in polite company. And he had a really good method of doing that. Like if he found himself in in a group of people, a circle of people, and he wanted to crack a really lewd joke, he'd reach out and he'd actually just touch the forearm of the most prudish person in that group, as if to say, it's okay, I'm about to say something really bawdy, but you'll be okay. And everyone would get the joke that way. So Bill could transgress or cross these sort of social borders. And as you say, he reached an age where he got sick of pretending to be one thing or another, and he just became Bill Leak. There was no one like him.
Yeah, when I said he was the most naturally talented person I ever met, that's no exaggeration. He had it all, didn't he? He could. He was very funny, and that's actually a good thing in a cartoonist. Not all cartoonists have it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
but he could. Go on.
Well, it's funny you should mention his sense of humour, because I talked at length with his very close friend and fellow cartoonist Warren Brown about this, and Warren has some very serious insights into Bill's sense of humour, and he's quite adamant that Bill learned to be funny. Bill was an extremely funny man, but it didn't come naturally to Bill, and Warren explains it very well in the book, that that Bill acquired this sense of humour and worked on it. He makes this analogy: if you want to be rich, you hang around rich people. And in Bill's case, if you want to be funny, you hang around funny people. And Bill did. All his friends were funny. So Bill acquired his sense of humour, which, to his credit, he became the greatest cartoonist that Australia's ever known. So, he was very good at it.
Yeah, and he did work hard at it. He worked hard from the moment he woke up to the moment he finally filed that cartoon, didn't he? And he had a habit of ringing people for ideas and workshopping and bouncing things off them and picking things up, which he'd keep in that book he called Rough as Guts,
Yes.
which you have access to, of course, for this, which must have been a great source. But he certainly worked hard at that, but also at his artistic skill, didn't he? Those cartoons can sometimes look effortless, but when you look into them, into the detail, in the artistic techniques that he used to express, say, anger or energy by putting a person's line at 45 degrees, all those little tricks which he divulged to me one by one like a conjurer telling me how things were done. They weren't effortless, were they?
Only a great artist could depict body language the way Bill did. There's no cartoonist I know of anywhere in the world who understood body language the way Bill did. The first time I ever saw him do a cartoon was in his little office in the Australian back in the mid-90s. And he wanted to draw someone, he was drawing some, idiot, some politician or power broker. And he wanted to get the hand gesture just right. And what he did, he went like this. He went, and he looked at his hand and went, and he moved his fingers a little bit and went, right, that's it. And he drew those fingers down. Hands are actually very expressive things. There's even great artists who don't even get that. But body language in particular, he was extremely good at. One of my favourite cartoons is of Gough Whitlam arriving in heaven. And God is on his throne, and he sees Gough arrive, and he goes, "Oh my God!" And Gough goes, "Please call me Gough," and Gough's gesture is just beautiful because it's not as if he's walked there. He's got both his legs are together and he's bowing forward as if God is ready to receive him. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful body language, but also Gough is reaching out his hand, and God is reaching out to touch it. And it's the hands almost touching between Adam and God from the Sistine Chapel, if you look closely enough. So you're right, Bill embedded jokes into his cartoons that sometimes you wouldn't see until, half an hour or a day or a week or months later. You know, I reckon there were jokes in Bill's cartoons that not even he knew he was drawing, in the body language and in the gestures and in the expressions. He was so good at it.
And he'd draw people in quite unexpected guises, didn't he? I mean, he had the way he'd pick a character, and Kevin Rudder's Tintin, for instance, and just hammer that home day after day. And one of his later in his later cartoons, Bill Shorten as the glove puppet on the Fist of the Union leader. One of which I have the original sitting here on my wall in the office. Is a beautiful way of doing it, and then doing that day after day after day until people, the joke became more and more funny.
Well, the jokes became jokes in their own right. You know, so Bill loved boxing rings, for example. So a lot of his gags were set in boxing rings. But for example, you know, his most famous cartoon, Yeah, Righto, What's His Name Then? That line became the standard line in a bunch of subsequent cartoons. So, you know, he was actually creating his own jokes that would live on, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, he was... and also, when he mixed those characters together, when he depicted John Howard as Mother Teresa, or Laurel and Hardy, who was it? Howard and Costello as Laurel and Hardy, and so on. His depth of knowledge of popular culture and of classical art was so broad that he was able to mash up characters in the most unexpected ways, and it created enormous comic potential, because some of these mashups were just so unlikely that they were absurd and they were funny in their own right.
Let's, in order to set up what we'll come to later, which is Bill's epiphany, if you like, in politics, if it was that. Let's set up where he was during the Howard years. He was with a group called the Primates, who'd have long lunches. They considered themselves intellectuals, and they were indeed, but some of the behaviour, of course, you can read about in the book is hilarious, but in the context of today's safety first world is somewhat unusual. But look, the politics of that day, he was every appearance profoundly anti John Howard. I remember even in John Howard's later days as Prime Minister, I remember him ringing me one Saturday or Friday it was about Saturday's paper. He'd ring me and run through the cartoon just to make sure it passed muster. And he said, well, Nick, this is how it's going to look. I've got John Howard standing on the table in his underpants, and I said, draw it, Bill. He said, you don't want to know what the gag is? I said, you've just told me.
Yeah.
But that was Bill, right? So just tell me first about his relationship with John Howard, and indeed an almost close to what you might call a diplomatic incident over that, wasn't there?
Mate, his relationship with John Howard is one of the great arcs of the book. There was an instance when John Howard ended Bill's career, according to someone very senior at the Australian. Bill drew a cartoon that was deeply offensive. It wasn't intended for the newspaper, and he was in Canberra at the time, and he was so proud of it that he photocopied it and sent it to a whole bunch of people around Canberra, and it just it went viral. That's the word we use these days, but in those days it went viral via photocopiers and fax machines, and eventually it landed on John Howard's desk, and could have been, it involved, you know, John Howard and another world political leader, and it could have got Bill in a lot of trouble if Howard had been so inclined. And Howard wasn't. And Dennis Shanahan, the boss of the Canberra Bureau of the Australian, it was his job to clean up this mess, and he did it very effectively. But he explained to me that Howard wasn't the type of politician to choose the option of ruining a journalist's career, no matter how egregiously he'd been offended. So to Howard's credit, he didn't do anything, didn't take any serious action against Bill. And of course, later on, Bill and he had quite a significant friendship. So it's one of the great stories of the book, that Bill was so vehemently and viscerally opposed to the Howard government, and then eventually came round to seeing the world very much through John Howard's eyes.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the various theories as to why that was in a moment. But first, it's a very revealing book. You don't spare Bill and his failings at all. In fact, you portray them as a very important part of what he was. Of course, his alcoholism, his love life, his varied love life, all those things seem to be part of that character. I think one of the bravest people who helped you, contributed to you in writing this book was Jan Rickmans, Jan was, I suppose it's fair to say, the love of his life in a way, the unrequited love of his life, and she's very, very frank about their relationship, and she does it because she told you, I think, that it was very important to understand these failings in Bill. I'll just quote a little bit of what she said. He was very vulnerable behind closed doors. He was trying to create a persona of toughness and create a narrative that he grew up in this very rough environment. But what I really saw was a dichotomy of two profoundly different men. There was a lot of fear within Bill. I think it was insecurity. He wanted so much to be accepted, and that really surprised me because he was the most naturally brilliant man I knew. That's right, isn't it, Fred? It was a side which I think you no doubt saw, and I saw glimpses of, but very different from the public side of Bill. That insecurity, that desire to be wanted.
Yeah, and I don't want to contradict the point we both agreed on earlier, that there was a hidden side of Bill. I don't think that. I mean, Jeanne says that she saw the sensitive side of him, but so did you and I. I mean, there was a deep need in Bill to be liked. He had a great gift for friendship, but I think it came from a need to be liked, and that was one of the driving forces of his life. So, I admire Jeanne enormously for how candid she was in that chapter, and she does indeed reveal an enormous amount. I mean, if anything from that chapter, you understand just how sensitive Bill was. The rest of the book does kind of testify to that, but with Jeanne, he really was, and the tragedy of their relationship was that he couldn't control his alcoholism at the time, and she had to ditch him because he was just too volatile. And they continued to be friends for long afterwards, and I think they both understood that they'd let a very good opportunity slip by, or Bill had let a very good opportunity slip by. Jeanne's candour is essential to the book, but Bill did find love later in life with Gung, and this doesn't diminish the love he had for Astrid either, which I find that's a really charming love story too. He was so young. He was living in a foreign country, living in Germany, barely spoke the language, and fell absolutely head over heels with a woman who had been an orphan. I mean, there's a beautiful love story in that as well. And then, of course, with Gung at the end of his life, where they formed just the most deep and loving and practical partnership. That's what was enormously valuable to Bill at the end. They were such a good couple because she was such a good cook, and he was the raconteur host. And as you know, visiting Bill's place in the last couple of years was quite an event. It was, yeah.
Let's go into that tempestuous last decade or so of his life, which begins, I think, it's punctuated, I guess, with another drunken accident. His most spectacular when he falls off a balcony and incurs head damage and is airlifted to hospital and from John Singleton's house and very nearly died. It was a very trying and testing moment for Bill, of course, but also for his friends. But he recovered, which I thought was remarkable. It seemed to me that a man who'd sustained potential brain damage like that wasn't going to be able to come out as multi-dexterous as he went in. You know, he'd lose one of his skills. It might be writing, it might be speaking, it might be drawing, it might be music. Who knows? But he came out pretty intact, didn't he? I think he lost a bit of his sense of taste. But it was a turning point for him. And of course, this goes to the question of why he changed his politics. And this is something that his friends on the left said it was the knock to the head. They always want to portray conservatism as some kind of mental illness. But I will quote from Bill himself, who you quote, which I think really sums it up. So the fall's in late November 2007. And Bill writes in 2012.
2008.
Sorry, 2008 was it?
Yeah.
So in 2012, 4 years later, right, he writes, "So what was it that turned me into a right-wing shrill? Kevin bloody Rudd had won the election. And me, I turned into a fascist overnight." That seems to be the most satisfying explanation, really. He just found the modern Labour Party not the Labour Party he supported as a young man. Would that be fair?
Precisely, yeah. He got a lot of satisfaction out of writing that piece because there were a lot of people speculating that brain damage had caused Bill's shift to the right. In that piece, he said, you know, everyone thought my shift to the right happened sometime after 2008, but in fact it happened in 2007 when Kevin Rudd was elected Prime Minister, and it was his job to be critical of the left. And he was very good at it. But what then happened after 2008, it was a slow process. Bill did become more aware that the left had become censorious, and that the people who adhered to what he'd always adhered to, which is freedom, were all on the right. So, you know, the shift wasn't a conscious one. It was one where he remained true to his principles, but realised that the company he kept was not the right company. So he described when he looked at the Rudd government, he saw social engineers. And to a classic libertarian, which is what Bill was, that is just as bad as what the Howard government had been, which he thought were, in his words, punishers. He thought the Howard government were a bunch of right-wing tyrants who despised the working class. That's how he saw the Howard government. The incoming Labor government under Kevin Rudd, they were social engineers, which is just as bad. So his transition was to someone who understood the classical libertarian concepts from the Enlightenment. It was a natural transition for him to make. And the people he left behind, well, of course they're going to resent it. And of course they're going to try to find ways of explaining it. And brain damage would be an easy way to do so, but that's just lazy.
Yeah, and it's important to point out, Fred, isn't it, that it's not like he was always beloved of the left establishment. He was always a man who'd say, says who. He wasn't going to be railroaded into agreeing with points of view or going along with conventions. In fact, he thought that cartoonist's job was actually to transgress those conventions, and that if you were just saying everything that the comfortable left agreed with, then you weren't being very funny.
Well, he thrived on provoking people, and so I don't think he liked doing anything that was predictable. But there's one of the most astute quotes in the entire book is from Paul Kelly, who interviewed Bill in 1994 as a prospective cartoonist and illustrator. And Paul Kelly said, I'm paraphrasing from memory, but it was something like, Bill just wanted to show off. Bill just wanted to take down the phony elites and frauds. And that's the impression that Bill gave Paul Kelly when he applied for the job. And, I pulled Paul up on it. I said, but yeah, he was such a lefty in those days. And Paul said, no, he wasn't. He wasn't a dyed-in-the-wool lefty. He was a free thinker. And Paul Kelly was right. That's how that was how Bill approached his job as a cartoonist. If he saw a phony elite or a fraud, he was after them, no matter what side of politics they came from.
Yeah. And as you write, the mobs who hounded him simply resented his honesty. It's a simple fact of human nature that people prefer to vilify others than have their ideas challenged, especially by a cartoonist. Bill wore it with fortitude. Let's go on to then the trials and tribulations of this final decade on this earth. Starting with the Muhammad cartoon, just remind us of the sequence of events there.
So he was at home by himself, and Gung, his Thai wife, was returning from a trip to Thailand, and she came into the house and he said to her, "Have you heard what happened in Paris?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, there's been some cartoonists have been killed at the office of Charlie Hebdo." And Bill was holding back tears. Now, Bill doesn't have any association with Charlie Hebdo other than they are his fraternity as cartoonists and satirists. And he was he was seriously upset that suddenly cartooning had become a life and death occupation. So he didn't flinch. Within days, he had produced a cartoon committing the same crime that those French cartoonists had been killed for, and that is a depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. And to its eternal credit, the Australian published it. Then Bill found himself the subject of chatter online among people who were identified by the Australian Federal Police as well connected within Islamic militant Islam circles and radical jihadis. And the advice was he had to move house. One of the main reasons for that was that Bill's house at the time, which he owned up on the Central Coast, was opposite Brisbane Water, a tidal flat on Brisbane Water, which is the estuary up that way. And the Federal Police speculated that it would be easy to turn up in a boat loaded with ammunitions and explosives, do whatever jihadis would wish to do to Bill and his family, and escape by boat before anyone knew what had happened. So not only was it advisable for him to find a more secret location, but also one away from the water, which is what he did. But, he and Gung, didn't hestate. He consulted Gung over this, and she was she unconditionally and unhesitatingly supported his intentions in this issue. And she's not unfamiliar with this topic, as you know, Nick. She grew up in southern Thailand, and in the primary school that she attended as a child, she was one of the few Buddhists in the school. She was surrounded by Thai Muslims, so she knows what the Muslim religion can be like when radical Islamics are offended, and she didn't hesitate. She was just like Bill.
It was a huge disruption, wasn't it? He had, his house had to be basically fitted out as a fortress. He had doors that were made bulletproof. He had alarms that were connected to some headquarters somewhere. And I remember him joking with me that he'd gone and got a gun. It wasn't until I read your book that I realised he actually did.
Yeah, he did. And he answered the door with it in his pocket once as well. So, yeah, Bill being Bill, he had connections in circles where procuring a firearm illegally was quite possible, and so he did so. It was only a low caliber revolver, and he was actually able to practice a few shots in his front yard without raising the alarm, because it, the noise it made didn't sound like an M16. So. He got a gun. He had, dumbbells in his office in case he needed them in the case of an attack, and he had a room in his house that he could retreat to, which had a really strong door and was specially reinforced. So the threats were taken extremely seriously, and especially by Bill. I think it messed him up a bit too. You probably remember, Nick. I mean, this would mess with you for a while. It made him. I think paranoid is too strong a word, but it did make him feel a bit besieged, and he started to see his friendships along the same line. If he felt that you were in any doubt about where he was heading, then he didn't value your friendship as much anymore, I think. Luckily you and I were more politically aligned with him, and so our friendships survived. But, there were times during this period when he had to reassess some of his friendships because his life was under threat. So, naturally it would mess with your mind, mess with your head a bit.
Well, I mean, that what you've just described, it's what happened to Salman Rushdie, it's what's happened to others. And you shudder to think how you and I would respond in that situation, right? It's one of the most horrible things you can imagine happening to you. But it's important to put that on the record, to think about that before we move on to the next episode, which is his run-in with the Timsuk Pomasan and Gillian Triggs at the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission, or Human Rights Commission.
Yep.
Because, you'd think on the surface, a brush with the Human Rights Commission is not going to be anywhere as bad as have your life threatened by Muslims, but Muslim terrorists, I should say. But I think it was worse for him in many ways, and horrible. Did you get that sense that he saw that as a more intense form of punishment still? Absolutely.
Like without a doubt. I mean, if the threat from radical Muslims had disturbed him because he had to move house and they had misunderstood his cartoon, that's one thing. But for the Human Rights Commission and various other, woke, censorious scolds around the country, especially on Twitter, for them to accuse him of racism was far worse. Because as you know, mate, Bill was the least racist... Sorry.
Yeah, I certainly never knew anybody.
Bill was the least... Sorry, this happens to me occasionally, mate. I'm sorry about that. Bill was the least racist person you could possibly imagine. He was so egalitarian, which goes back to his deep love of Australia, which is, one of the founding... not one of the founding principles, but one of the fundamental principles of Australia is egalitarianism. And Bill took that to heart. It was one of his guiding principles in life. He treated every person equally, whether they were the Prime Minister of Australia or the taxi driver who picked him up from a pub. He was profoundly egalitarian. And for him to be described as racist would have disturbed him to his core. And so that battle, which did go on for quite some time, it wasn't quite as long as a year, but it was a very bitter battle, and it had barely been resolved when he died. Yeah, that disturbed him.
Yeah, so that the famous cartoon, I think most people will be familiar with it. If you're not, then it's another good reason to buy Fred's book and familiarise yourself with it again. But it was essentially a cartoon that was drawing attention to the tragedy of life for many Aboriginal children. It was a plea for pity for them rather than anything else. And yet it was deemed to be racist. But you set that up very well, I think, Fred, in the book, by going back to an earlier cartoon, more than 10 years before. Describe that cartoon to me, which didn't, of course, have the same reaction.
Oh, so this is the cartoon of the Aboriginal woman being bashed by an Aboriginal man. She's slumped on the ground, leaning against a tree, and he's about to... she's got a black eye. He's about to bash her, and bash her again, I should say. And it was a depiction of a situation that had just been revealed in some Aboriginal community, which Warren Mundine had been talking about. And he said, Warren Mundine, who's a leading Aboriginal advocate in Australia, he'd said that the problem with most politics regarding Aboriginal issues is that they're too touchy-feely. And the man in the cartoon is bearing down on this poor benighted woman and says, you want touchy-feely, I'll give you touchy-feely. And obviously it's, the touching is, the touchy-feely is of a violent nature. Now, Bill's cartoon of that was, there's nothing particularly funny about that. It was a dramatic illustration of what was happening and what Warren Mundine was talking about. But this kind of precedes the proliferation of social media, and so he kind of got away with it. Really, it was an accurate depiction of a really horrible situation that was happening in Aboriginal communities, and because it wasn't able to be shared so quickly on social media, it didn't generate the same storm that Bill did some years later in 2016, when he did something similar. The victim in that situation was an Aboriginal child. In the subsequent cartoon in 2016, the victim was an Aboriginal child, and there's an Aboriginal dad involved and an Aboriginal cop. The deliberate misreading on social media in that instance was that Bill had criticised all Aboriginal men as being hopeless dads. And to read that cartoon that way is just simply absurd. It's either to read it that way, you're either an idiot or you are deliberately misreading it. Either way, I don't care. I don't care what it is. It's still wrong.
Yeah.
Bill copped it as a result. There's probably. Until then, probably the most famous cartoon in Australian history would be Stan Cross's "For Gore's sake, stop laughing, this is serious," which was drawn probably 80, 90 years earlier. Bill's cartoon of "Yeah, righto, what's his name then?" has far surpassed that as the most famous cartoon in Australian history now. Unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons, but hopefully in the long term, it will continue to draw attention to the horrible circumstances in which children grow up in Aboriginal communities, and hopefully one day lead to better conditions for those kids. Because at the moment, those kids have nothing to hope for. They have nothing. Their parents don't have jobs. They don't have schools to go to. They suffer from malnutrition. Some of them have sexually transmitted diseases before they're even old enough to go to school. I mean, this is seriously hellhole situation that Bill was trying to draw attention to, and he copped grief for it. And it's just wrong.
It's an indication of how fast things are spiralling out of control on the left. Back then, that cartoon, through 2000 and
16.
You tell me, 5 years ago?
Yes.
It was clearly what we'd now call, an example of cancel culture. But at the time, I don't think we used that expression. It wasn't something that was familiar. It hadn't yet formed a word to describe it. We knew they were censorious, we knew they were liberal, but by any measure, it become much stronger now and a much bigger force to be reckoned with. In your conversations with Bill, what does he think of this? Is he astounded? Is he horrified?
Yeah, he is. He is It's funny you should call it cancel culture, because in Bill's day, when he was still alive, it was just simply called politically incorrect. And I think the term identity politics was just beginning to emerge around then. So Bill was bewildered by the fact that he was being vilified for that. He despaired, mate. He really did. I mean, I remember getting a couple of emails from him where he despaired at the way people were denigrating the truth. There's this, along with cancel culture, there is this emerging idea that truth is relative or truth is personal. Bill just thought that was absolute bullshit. The truth is immutable. The truth cannot be disputed. Sorry, it took me a while to get to that word. The truth cannot be disputed. And to him it was as clear as day. That's another thing about Australian culture that he adored so much, is that we are generally pretty blunt people. If you're talking bullshit, you'll know in the presence of genuine Australians, you'll soon find out that what you're talking is a load of crap. And Bill grew up believing that that was actually a virtue. And then suddenly, late in life, he found himself surrounded by people who not only didn't recognise the truth when they saw it, but actually spouted bullshit and believed it. So, they were difficult times for Bill, and he saw in it, getting back to the emails that I remember him sending me back in the day, he saw in it the very demise of civilization. He didn't think that civilizations could survive if there wasn't a widespread. You don't have to know what the truth is, but you have to accept that we are all looking for it. And when as a culture, in some ways, we stopped looking for it, Bill just saw red lights flashing all over the place.
Bill, Fred, when I read your book, I started towards the end. Those were the bits that I wanted to read about first, the bits that we lived through with him in those final years, and I thought, this is a very painful book. I don't know whether I can get through the whole book, because of course not only we've got personal memories of Bill, but what the issues that it's thrown up are not trivial as regards the future. But I want to just go back to and read it backwards, if you like, as I did,
Yeah.
and go back to the earlier sections in the book where you just get this great character of a man who's so full of life, so full of enthusiasm, creativity, just determined to see off whatever obstacles come his way. That to me is the redemptive part in the book. We like redemptive endings. You've got the redemptive bit in the middle where we see Bill at his prime, also at his most where his faults show much more. But that to me is essential that people read that part of the book.
Well, one of the astounding things about Bill is that he started out life with such a drive to become a great artist. He really did want to be a great artist. I mean, I'm quoting Astrid in the book saying he wanted to be the greatest artist in the world, and I don't doubt that. He was an extraordinarily ambitious man all throughout his life. That ambition transposed onto cartoons later. But as a young man, art was everything. But the other thing about Bill, as you know, Nick, is he was extraordinarily articulate. So, you know, unlike most artists who don't place much importance on verbal communication, they generally, you know, leave it to whatever they can communicate on canvas. Bill pursued verbal communication with as much passion, and he was incredibly good at it. And one of the great gifts of the book, one of the great advantages of this book, is that I was given access to hundreds and hundreds of letters. There's probably more than 1,000 of them, in fact, that he wrote to his family, which his sister Lynn lovingly kept all these years later. And I was very, very graciously given access to them. And they're a treasure trove into the formation of this serious young artist and the ideas that he arrived at in his early 20s. And it's just they were just a joy to read, mate, because, you know, I was reading them. These are letters that he wrote almost 20 years before I met him, and I was reading them and I could hear his voice. He didn't change much. His principles did not change much throughout his life, which is what made him such a force of nature.
Fred, you say this book is a tribute to his strength and is my own humble attempt to prove that the accusations made against him in the final years of his life were not only false, they were the very opposite of the man I knew and loved. You've achieved that in this book, Fred. Congratulations. But more than that, I think you've done us a great service by putting on the record the life of this great man who I think we should remember for all times, a great Australian, a great contributor to culture, to Australian life, and a great presence in the lives of his many friends. So thank you for doing that, Fred.
Oh, thanks, mate, and thanks for having me in. You know as much as I do how important Bill was to, you know, the country that Australia became, and you know he adored us, and we loved him back for it. He was a great man. We miss him a lot.
Mm. And there's many people to thank, of course, as you do in the book, but special mention, I think, to John Roscombe and the team at the IPA who backed you on this, who've published the book, and you can buy the book from them. We'll put a link to that at the bottom, in the notes at the bottom of the podcast, and in the YouTube video that accompanies this, or you can go onto a website and find the notes there, or just click on the IPA's website, I guess. But whatever you do, get a copy of this book. It's a very important one. Fred, thanks once again.
Thanks, mate.